Well, I hope everybody's had a good time so far in the course. We've finished our first 2 weeks where we've gone over some of the historical documents that make up, that discuss some of the ethical issues that have occurred in the past in various clinical trials. And we've also looked at a few of the historical documents related to ethics in clinical trials. So we're putting our foundational knowledge together. And I did post out there on the discussion board the FDA guidance to industry, or guidance for industry rather, on the use of control groups, the use of placebos. A couple of you, someone asked about that, and so I put that document out there. I would encourage you to go out there and download it and kind of take a look at it. I think you'll find it to be fairly interesting. So in this week's lessons, what we're going to do is we're going to take the information that we've learned that's been foundational and see how it begins to shape and even govern what we do on a daily basis with our daily tasks as they relate to the clinical research environment. So for this week's readings, what I'd like for you to do is look at the FDA regulations overview presentation by Dr. Hirschfield. It's about 30 slides. I think it'll give you a pretty good overview of what that consists of, what those regulations consist of. And then our good clinical practice requirements are contained in basically in two places. We have 21 CFR 312, which is investigational new drug application, subpart D, which is the responsibilities of sponsors and investigators. I'll put the link out there on Blackboard to that specific regulation, and it's about 9 pages. So I'd like you to kind of read through that and be familiar with it. I don't think it'll take you very long to do that. The other section of good clinical practice that I want you to take a look at is ICH GCP E6 sections 4 and 5. They are in your textbook starting on page 83, and they're about 10 pages or so. The difference between these two, for those of you that aren't familiar with them, is that 21 CFR 312 are actually laws that are part of the federal code. Section 21 governs drugs, and specifically pharmaceutical drugs, and several parts or subparts of that code govern excuse me, how we conduct clinical trials. ICH, on the other hand, is the International Conference on Harmonization. It's made up of a consortium of regulatory authorities in 3 different regions: the United States, Europe, and Japan. Most of the countries in the world now follow ICH guidelines as far as how they conduct and regulate clinical trials. It is important to understand that although it's a guideline, the FDA does recognize ICH GCP E6 specifically as their standard, as their current thinking. They call it in terms of clinical practice, good clinical practice. So as you look through those 3 documents, that'll give you a pretty good idea of, of how those regulations are similar and how they're different. So our learning objectives for this week for good clinical practice are going to be to discuss the GCP requirements associated with FDA regulations, and these are found in 21 CFR, that stands for Code of Federal Regulations, and also in ICH Guidelines E6. Of course, ICH is the International Conference on Harmonization. The principal difference is that anything in 21 CFR is actually a federal regulation, which means it is the law. And of course, if you don't follow the law, there's going to be some penalties associated with that. But I'll put the link out there for both of those sources. So you'll find the link in the week 3 content page. When you click on the link for the FDA regulations, it'll actually take you to the FDA website. And then from there, you can very quickly find the different sections of that regulation. The ICH guidelines, however, for E6 are actually a PDF document that I've stored out there, but you can also access that through the ICH website as well. So a couple of things that we're going to do. We're going to cite the differences and similarities between the FDA and the ICH GCP requirements. So as you kind of get familiar with those documents, you will find that there are going to be a few differences, not very many. One thing to remember is that currently, almost all of the nations around the world recognize the ICH guidelines as their primary good clinical practice standard. Even the FDA at this point has accepted the ICH guidelines as its current thinking, as they call it, for good clinical practice, even though there are some differences between the two. And we'll kind of discuss those during this week and as we progress throughout the course. So for this week, I want you to take a look at those. There are also a couple of other documents out there for you to take a look at. For example, there's an overview of federal regulations written by Dr. Hirschfield. It's actually a PowerPoint presentation. It's about 30 slides. Won't take you very long to kind of read through that, but probably do that first because it'll give you a pretty good primer of what's in store as you go through the FDA regulations and the ICH guidelines. And then if you look in the content document that I posted for week 3, that'll be the first item that you'll notice on Moodle. It will give you some instructions as far as which portions of the regulation and which portions of the guideline you should sort of pay attention to. So I told you to scan a couple portions of it, and I've also said to read a couple sections. But if you'll notice in that document, I've indicated the page length of those, so you'll have a pretty good idea of how much time would be associated with that. So the next thing that I want you to do for this week is to get started on your Project 1, which is going to be a comparison of GCP requirements for both FDA and ICH, and that will be due on September 14th. So you'll have an entire week or more to get that completed. It won't take you very long to do it. I think the instructions out there are fairly simple. There's an article written by Paul Below that I'd like for you to read that actually summarizes many of the similarities and differences. I'd like for you to use that as a foundational reference to complete the exercise. Completing the exercise is probably just going to take you a few hours to do it. There won't be any discussion forum this week, so you'll concentrate your effort on completing that and then getting it handed in. So if there are any questions that you have about that, please post them in the discussion forum titled Questions for the Instructor. That way everybody can see them and then everybody can see my responses. So please do that if you have questions about it, but I think that is pretty self-explanatory. I don't think anyone's going to have any, but if you do, feel free to go ahead and post those out there. As I just mentioned, good clinical practice is what we refer to as how we operate in a clinical research environment, in a regulated environment. And there are basically two documents that explain that. First, we have the FDA regulations, which are the law for clinical trials that are conducted in the United States or are also conducted under the jurisdiction of the FDA, which could include and does include sites that are around the world. So even though we think of the FDA as being primarily a US-based agency, any trial that's conducted under an investigational new drug application that's been submitted to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, any sites that are conducting a trial under that IND are subject to the jurisdictional authority of the FDA. They can be inspected by the FDA. They can be held accountable for not following FDA guidelines. So keep that in mind as we go through everything this week. We also have the ICH, International Conference on Harmonization, GCP guidelines. They're contained in Section 6 of the ICH document. And most of the countries around the world have accepted those as their standard practice for conducting clinical trials. As I mentioned earlier, the FDA does consider ICH GCP to be the agency's current thinking on good clinical practice. So kind of keep that in mind. As you go through and you look at these and you read them and you digest them, you'll discover that they're very similar. There are some differences, some fairly specific differences, but there aren't very many. They're very, very similar, and I think you'll see that as you go along and take a look at them. So, for instance, in the FDA Good Clinical Practice Guidelines, Section 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations that governs drugs, there are basically several parts that we want to pay attention to with regard to clinical trials. So, for example, 21 CFR Part 11 discusses electronic records and electronic signatures and some of the requirements associated with that. For those of you that were in the Introduction to Data Management class, we discussed some of those in that class. The next area is 21 CFR Part 50, which is the protection of human subjects. We'll actually refer to that a little later in our course. The next one we'll focus on is going to be 21 CFR 54, which is financial disclosure, where principal investigators and others conducting a trial are required to disclose any financial positions that they may have with a sponsor that they're conducting a trial on behalf of. 21 CFR 56 governs the use of institutional review boards, how they're comprised, how they operate, what their responsibilities are. We'll get into those a little bit later in the course. The one that you'll probably spend most of your time on is going to be 21 CFR Part 312, which is the requirements for the investigational new drug application, specifically Subpart D, which is responsibilities for investigators and sponsors. And then finally, the other area that we touch on a little bit in this course is going to be the new drug application, which is contained in 21 CFR 314. So to round out this week, there's no discussion forum. Instead, we're going to be working on Project 1, which is our comparison of good clinical practice between the FDA and ICH. So in the Project 1 section on Moodle, you'll see that there is an article written by Paul Belo that I alluded to earlier that discusses the differences between the FDA regulations and the ICH guidelines contained in E6. So as you go through this week, you'll be looking at both of those documents, becoming familiar with them, learning more about them. So your assignment is going to be to choose 4 of the 6 topics, and then what you'll do is you will compile a comparison of the similarities and differences between the FDA regulations and the ICH guidelines on the specific 4 topics that you selected. So you've got some choice there. It will be due on September 14th, which will be probably a week from this coming Monday as you listen to this. So I think you'll have plenty of time to do it. I don't think it'll take very long to do it. I think it'll be a very, very interesting exercise for you in kind of seeing how they compare and contrast. If you have specific questions, put them on the discussion forum for questions to the instructor so that everyone can see them and see the responses. But do go ahead and turn those in on time. It will be a graded assignment, so you need to make sure that you're conducting that in the time frame so that you can complete it on time. Do make sure you use the spell checker and grammar checker in Microsoft Word. Don't want anybody getting points deducted because of misspelling or improper use of language. So at any rate, go ahead and get started on that. And if you have questions, please let me know.